Welcome to the Leadership for Society Speaker Series. The theme this year is Tensions, Business, Civic Society, and Politics. I'm Brian Lowery, Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And today I'm speaking with Mariano-Florentino Cuéllar, also known as Tino. Can I call you Tino?
You absolutely can.
Thank you. Thank you. So Tino is the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So good to have you on, Tino.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Brian. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. So you have a really interesting background. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe a bit about what you did before Carnegie?
Sure. I was born in northern Mexico, in a region that is known for a lot of back and forth trade, legal and otherwise, between the United States and Mexico. It's also frequently visited by hurricanes that come up from the Gulf of Mexico. And sometime when I was in my teenage years, I had the great opportunity to immigrate to the United States and grew up along the border, but on the American side of the border eventually, in places like Calexico, California. I was lucky to come to California because it is a complicated, multi-layered, massive experiment in democracy. I feel like there are so many aspects to it that I'm still wrapping my mind around them entirely. Went to school on the East Coast, decided to get interested in the intersection of government, psychology, and economics. And that led me eventually to law school. And actually, in the tail end of my college years before going to law school, I got interested in artificial intelligence, but that was a long time ago, in the early 1990s, you could say. And then had a kind of a triple career where I focused on being in academia and getting tenure at Stanford Law School and teaching administrative law, international law, executive power, citizenship and migration, tech policy and the law, that kind of stuff. But then I also had a career in government where I worked at the Treasury Department, at the White House, eventually on the California Supreme Court as a justice. And then I've also had a career in nonprofits where I served on the board of the Cuéllar Foundation. And now I lead a complex organization that's all about doing research to inform policymakers and to help them figure out how to cooperate effectively without being naive.
Mm-hmm. You've been a busy guy.
Thank you. I'm sorry my answer was a little on the long side, but it's a really dangerous thing when you ask somebody to tell you a little bit about themselves.
No, it was fantastic. It was fantastic. And I'm going to focus in on a couple of things. One is the AI interest you had, and the other is kind of the governance international interest, because you are the president of an organization that has international peace in its name. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the most important effects of emerging technologies like AI on international relations, because we know that it's having a huge effect, certainly domestically, in how people are thinking about work and what the future of AI might be. But there's also concerns about how it might affect engagements across nations. So I'm wondering, as you think about AI, what are the things that you most top of mind for you in terms of international relations?
So I would say we should start by recognizing that throughout most of the history of what we now call artificial intelligence, there's been this process where the field is the enterprise of doing AI, making progress on AI, is defined as trying to understand the processes that will let you automate what normally is understood to require human intelligence to do. But notice that definition carries with it a kind of implicit moving line, because this notion of what is ordinarily taken to require intelligence to do means that what had previously been something that you might have expected to require human intelligence, like decoding the scratches I might make on a page that only I could decode, into writing, into character recognition that can become digital, is really old technology now. It's considered pretty commonplace, kind of boring. But at one point, that was a kind of artificial intelligence. The idea that you might build a system that could play chess effectively would have been viewed as a perfect example of cutting edge artificial intelligence at one point. And now, chess, even the game Go, which has more moves and possibilities, some would argue that there might be stars or even atoms in the universe, that has fallen by the wayside in terms of a frontier that has been breached. So nowadays, to answer your question, I would note ways in which AI has had an effect in the past, is having an effect in the present, and will have an effect in the future. And I'll note that the future part is always tricky, because even if we're trying to be humble and careful about what predictions we make, the truth is that it's very hard to anticipate in the middle of a period of rapid technological change exactly how it's going to turn out. How did we get here? So one way that AI has affected international politics is that nowadays, probably very few people listening to this have ever gone a day without using some digital device, without checking your email, posting something on X, I guess is what we're supposed to call it now, who knows, or doing something in social media, maybe having a kid look at a TikTok video. That whole infrastructure of information consumption that is built into our lives is driven not so much by the choices you and I make about what to see, but by algorithms that curate what is put in front of us. Nowadays, that is not frontier cutting edge AI anymore, but it was in the past. So I would say one way AI has affected international relations is by being at the core of a system of information consumption that can often polarize opinion, make people upset or angry about things, show them videos that might be more extreme, facilitate the possibility that another country could use these tools to polarize opinion in a country that they view as their adversary, as the Russians attempted to do with respect to the US. In the very present, cutting edge AI that is about recognizing visual stimuli and triangulating with fuzzy information that lets you target what might have seemed like a really difficult to discern target is being built into drones, the most advanced ones that are, if not already being deployed, will be deployed very soon. And in the future, of course, there are two ways in which AI might be drastically important for humanity. One is that its own capacity to improve itself might help us get these technological and scientific breakthroughs to happen much more quickly. The other is that as we get closer to a kind of intelligence that appears, even if it doesn't actually, but appears to surpass human abilities, there will be more fighting and competition to control it, to shape it, and to decide what it does and how it does it.
That last one, there's a number of things you said that are really interesting to me, but I'm going to start with the last one. The fighting about shaping it and what we'll use it for. You think internationally, what you have to think about is vastly different cultures, vastly different values, but the technologies as they develop don't stay within the bounds of any particular culture or nation. How do you think about that? Like, how do we think about the challenges of overcoming these different value systems and ethical perspectives so it's in China or India or Japan or Canada or United States, and they don't all agree on what's right, what's ethical.
And you have touched something so important, Brian, but also it's, to mix my metaphors, you have touched the tip of the iceberg. I don't know exactly if that's physically possible, but let's assume it is for a moment. But if I follow that iceberg and look at what lies beneath, I would say two things. First of all, even inside one single country, think about Muslims and Hindus in India. Think about the sheer scale of the difference between Oklahoma and California. You have these contending values, even inside California itself. One reason I got interested in AI, actually way back when I was in college a little bit, was because the very rudimentary tools available back then still might give you a way of modeling human cognition, getting a sense of how does the people decide things, right? Which gets a little closer to your field. And I would say the irony now is that the AI systems that are becoming more commonplace as recommendation engines, as the brains to a drone, as the potential ingredient in the business plan of an organization that wants to make billions of dollars, like that those systems are now shaping our own cognition. And we don't just use those systems to understand and model human cognition. But more fundamentally, I would say the reason why it is important to be practical and not overly idealistic about any truly global project to control and govern AI is because of those distinctions you mentioned. There are distinctions of religion, of culture and values, of income and politics, of, at the end of the day, of geopolitical priorities and economic interests. Now, my organization was started in 11, with the vision of trying to use knowledge and ideas and research and rigorous thinking to try to help policymakers do better at planning how to cooperate without being naive, how to avoid war. So if I think about that paradigm and how it applies to AI, I would say, despite all the difficulties we've talked about, all those divisions, it is still possible, I believe, and my organization believes, to find some common ground among different countries, to have them work together, for example, to limit the risk that somebody is going to use a really sophisticated AI model to build a new cyber exploit or a new biological weapon. But it will require building trust, because many countries, even if they have somewhat aligned interests, they also have some divergent interests, and they don't really trust each other. So we work on that in whatever ways we can, but it's a much larger project, and we require probably a lot of help in doing that.
So I don't tend towards optimism, but I feel like you do. I get the sense that you're an optimistic kind of guy.
It's a risky business to be in these days, Brian, but we'll see how I feel at the end of our conversation.
So can you give me an example where historic example where something like this, so it's not AI, but we've had technological development since we've been human. So as you think of the current kind of geopolitical system where there's competition among countries, you go back, competition among empires or whatever, where there was cooperation on something of this importance, where gaining an edge would have tremendous value for your own country or empire or what have you. Is there an example where something like this has been regulated or governed internationally in a successful way?
Yes, I think so. I mean, not that it's all perfect, but let me start with asking you a question. What is the furthest, most remote place you've ever traveled to?
Oh, that's a really good question. Depends on what you mean by remote. I would say the hardest place I ever went was Machu Picchu. So I hiked Machu Picchu.
Oh, that is a tough thing. How did you get to Peru?
On a plane.
Okay, thank you. You can get on a plane in SFO, fly, maybe connecting in Mexico City, maybe in Miami, maybe nonstop, and land in Lima without really worrying that much that the plane is going to blow up on the way, that the parts are going to start flying off. I mean, these things do happen, of course, that Peru is going to say, I'm not going to let this kind of plane land over there. And at the same time, of course, Boeing and Airbus are in a furious competition for the commercial air market. Whether you fly United, American, or whatever other airline can take you there is a matter of fierce competition. And many of us who believe at some level in the market economy would say that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. And yet somewhere, and that somewhere is in Montreal, Canada, there is an international civil aviation organization that stays up all night thinking about what is necessary to keep that system that is embedded in a competitive world from falling apart. Making sure that if a plane is certified to fly in Europe and in the US, it could also fly in Peru and in Mexico, for example. And again, not perfect, but I think it is not a small thing that the world in our lifetime, Brian, has shrunk because you can get on a plane at SFO and get off in Lima, Peru. Mm-hmm. I would also add the example of nuclear weapons. And here I'll do it with care, because I'm not here to tell you that we've solved the problem of nuclear risk or annihilation. It's pretty scary business when you start to think about the sheer possibility that somebody might irresponsibly and recklessly risk the actual use of nuclear weapons. And let's remember, we're not just talking about the US, China, and Russia. We're talking about India, Pakistan. We're talking about North Korea. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the Middle East. So complicated realities. Yet, we got to the point in this world where we had, 80,000, 70,000, 60,000 nuclear warheads. Can you imagine that? Any one of those warheads, often much more powerful than the one used to destroy Hiroshima, or at least the core of it, which I just saw as a city and powerfully was moved by a museum there just a few days ago, actually. Mm-hmm. We have, closer to, 12, 15,000 these weapons now, depending on how you count them and whether you count the ones that are deployed or not deployed or whatever. But that's real progress. Like, the world has gone from having many, many, many more nuclear weapons to far fewer ones. The world has some slightly functioning mechanisms to try to reduce risks of nuclear programs that turn into weapons programs without some international validation or understanding. But we got a ways to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So those are interesting examples, and I take those as good examples. We could quibble about both of them, but I think there's certainly a case for cooperation. But there's also clearly competition, right? So when you think about going back to AI now, or even talking about the Industrial Revolution, there was all kinds of espionage to steal people's, whatever advances they'd made in terms of early technology and Industrial Revolution. Like there's just been a long history of fierce competition. And lately with AI, you could say that there's been pretty good evidence that state actors are trying to destabilize competitors through the use of technology. And so I just wonder, how do you balance regulation? So let's say, I'm just going to focus on domestic for a second. Let's say you want to regulate US technology in some way because you're concerned about negative effects in the society, but it hampers the speed at which the technology evolves in the United States. And some other country doesn't do that, and now they gain an advantage. How do you balance the need to protect some population, let's call it the domestic population, or we could name whatever population we like, against the need to keep up in terms of developments with competitors?
Yeah, it's an interesting set of questions. I would say, first of all, it's not always the case that rules set by a political jurisdiction that tries to make technology better, more efficient, is a detriment to competition. I would say, just take fuel efficiency standards in cars, right? If we as a jurisdiction say to these companies sometimes, you may not think right now you can do this, but we've done the math, we've looked at the engineering right now, and we think you can. And besides, that's sort of what the democratic process asking you to do. You might actually advantage your industry over time. That's one point. Second, I do think there are some examples of where most countries in the world have been concerned enough about just completely flouting any kind of ethical or normative limit around, for example, bioengineering involving humans, that, I could imagine, I could tell a story. It would be kind of a sci-fi story where a country gains an advantage by mastering that technology, experimenting with a bunch of humans, pushing the frontiers of what is possible, and then trying to reap the benefits in their soldiers and their engineers and their scientists. I think it's telling that as far as we know, that hasn't really happened. Now, that I put that in a little asterisk because I do note that there may be some things we don't know. The system isn't perfect. But I think you also have to factor in, to some degree, the normative human impulse not to do something that is crazy or destructive. The question then becomes how to build an institutional scaffolding around it to make it meaningful.
Mm-hmm. So, the normative human influence not to do something crazy or destructive is often usually backed by a fear of repercussions, let's say. So when you talked about the non-proliferation or the reduced proliferation of nuclear weapons, and you'd argue not the fact they haven't been used since World War II, you maybe chalk that up to an understanding of the consequences if they were. And so I'm going to now switch to a different kind of topic that you brought up earlier about AI and the history of AI replacing human ingenuity and what humans can do. That's really what it was. One potential consequence of that is widening social inequality. And so I wonder, how do you think about managing that consequence of improved AI or the further technological development in the direction which we're going?
I would say with care and focus, ideally. I think you're right to note that technology frequently widens social inequality. I think Darren Asimoglu, I think, has a book out that deals with this to some extent with a co-author. And that has been a fairly constant reality over the course of human history. If you think about, for example, the advent of agriculture, it was very much about instantiating a system that resulted in people living more unequal lives in many cases, and ones that they didn't enjoy as much as being hunter-gatherers in certain situations. Even the term barbarian has a quirky history around the efforts that were made by certain civilizations to effectively pull in folks who didn't want to be part of that kind of hierarchical agricultural milieu. That said, I think part of what makes technology so interesting, part of the reason I keep getting drawn back to these conversations, Brian, is because sometimes at the very same time that we are widening certain kinds of social inequality, we're reducing social inequality as well. And how then should the world make sense of some capability that lets you do both at the same time? What do I mean? What's an example? Well, I think if we were having this conversation 60 or 70 years ago, first of all, it wouldn't be happening the way it is digitally right now. We would probably see a world where there was more inequality than there is now around whether people got their basic caloric needs to survive. Still, in this day, in the 21st century, there are people dying of hunger. And that is painful to me, as I imagine it is to you too. But as a proportion of the global population, it's a much, much smaller number. Now, how that translates into an economic system that provides for a ton of innovation globally, particularly in some countries like the US, that yields things that have helped us reduce hunger, like the Green Revolution, which, by the way, was also helped by philanthropy. But that is a tough one. And I think with respect to digital technologies and eventually AI, we may face very similar questions. Like on the one hand, there is less inequality than there used to be with respect to how easily people can get information, watch a movie, reach someone on the other side of the world. But, if you look at the wealth distribution in some countries, there's growing inequality in terms of just how much raw wealth people have. And I think it's fair to say that some cutting edge work, probably even done by your colleagues, suggests that it's not always a trade-off. Perhaps you could have less inequality and just as much innovation. I don't know, though. I think it's a tough one, and it feels to me like that's where the conversation has to go a little bit. How do we balance some of those competing considerations?
And that's my question to you. How do we balance those considerations? Because you could argue that maybe it's not inherent in the technology. Maybe it's in the inequality the technology produced, and it's a feedback cycle. So there are people who have more and they have access to more, and as the technology improves, they benefit more from those improvements, and they are the people who are making decisions about how those technologies will be used and or regulated. So how do you, if that's true, if that's kind of a cycle there, like how does the average person or how do civic organizations play a role in deciding how technology will evolve or be regulated?
Yeah, so good question. And I think in some ways we can get there or get a little closer to answering by first doing process of elimination. I think those among us who believe that fast access to technology with no constraints automatically translates into improved human welfare are either not reading history or reading history but leaving it aside because they think that the outcome they're arguing for benefits them and it should be therefore what happens. The reality is closer to we have this constant push and pull with technology. And we can go back to literally the advent of fire, if you want to, and hand tools, where there is pain and there is benefit. There is more nutrition and then there's more harm at the same time, almost at every step. For many of us, that is consistent with generally supporting an economic ecosystem where we lean towards innovation and towards technological progress. But boy, do I think it's naive to think that that doesn't come without some need for some regulation. And so let's think for a moment about all the different ways that that has been true in our lifetime. It was 1990 when I graduated from high school. That used to make me seem and feel young. Now it makes me not young. But do you know that I believe that I'm getting this right from my climate team at Carnegie, that most of the emissions of carbon in human history have come since I graduated from high school. All the previous emitting done in all of human history from the dawn of time to the present, human-made, are less before 1990. Now, if you do the math, maybe it's not that surprising. We've got all these developing countries that are coming online. But the point is, I don't think I can say with a straight face that fossil fuels have been an unmitigated disaster for human well-being. They have brought us this technology, the materials that we're using, the plastics around us, better lives for a lot of people, the fertilizers in some cases people use as part of the efforts to feed the world and reduce hunger. But we've kind of backed ourselves into a corner now with respect to carbon and what's happened to the planet. And I think even people who are climate change skeptics have to kind of admit that you just don't want to pretend that there's no risk there, that we have something to actually worry. So anyway, all that is to say, there are basically three tools we can use to deal with that reality. And I think the main breakthrough point that I want to make to your listeners is that all these three tools can have a global implication and effect, but they start at the domestic level. The first is the liability system. You design a technology that works really great for you and you sell it and become a billionaire, but then that technology ends up blowing up my house, hurting my kid, making my wife sick. I should be able to take you to court. And maybe the court's answer is like, you know what? You assumed the risk when you bought that, Tino. Maybe the court's answer is actually Brian acted unreasonably when he sold this, because there were some easy steps he could have taken to either warn you about it or to make it safer, right? Liability. Second, regulation gets a bad name. There is such a thing as too much regulation. But if you design it right and target it right, let's take AI, since that's what you wanted to talk about. So if there are sophisticated systems that we increasingly use to help us make decisions about how to run an organization, how to hire people, how to allocate resources that we have to invest, anything else that really mattered, how to decide whether a patient should be, getting emergency care right now or can wait a couple days, there ought to be some testing of that system. That's not rocket science. That's not even science. It's common sense to my mind. Third, norms of use. You know what? Like when you're raising your kid and you are seeing that every waking moment that your kid is not eating or playing sports or doing homework, your kid is glued. I'm not talking about your kid, Brian, to be clear, but somebody's kid is glued to the screen. You might think that's like not a great thing. And you might want to intervene a little bit to set a different norm, right? All these things, if they happen somewhat globally, I think can help society move in the direction of getting to a better set of outcomes where we get the upside, but not as much of the risk.
That's fantastic. I mean, I love that as a kind of ending point, but I just want to open it up and see if there's anything else you'd want to leave the listeners with, because I think this is a really big topic and we're really just obviously just scratching the surface. But as you look forward, what is your biggest hope about the technologies that we're seeing right now that are capturing people's interest? What can you spin us a positive vision of how it's regulated, how it's operating around the world?
So I do think it is important to recognize we're living in a better world than we were in 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago. More clean water, more access to good nutrition, more electricity, which is pretty life-changing for a ton of people, more mobility, more freedom for people to decide where they're going to live in many cases, and, getting to the social stuff, better treatment of women, more decisions that people can make in many countries about who they want to be with. And that kind of cultural and social change has been almost always connected to the diffusion of technology. Have to acknowledge that, to my mind. By the same token, it feels to me like so many of the benefits that have come from the Green Revolution, from the internet, from electricity diffusion, from development more generally, are kind of better dealt with if we're just honest about the reality that we need to be prudent, that we need to have some common sense. And to me, that doesn't mean global governance of everything. It means more like countries trying to do the right thing for their people, but also occasionally being able to work together on a project where they act if something is going off the rails. They work together. They effectively share information and create the right institutions. I'll say one more thing about AI specifically. Pretty much any conversation about technology ends up being a bit of a reflection about human judgment and what's good and bad about it, right? So if I think about all the ways in which the internet has become complicated and difficult and dark, it's partly because that's a reflection of some aspects of human nature, as well as some of the good that we can do, which pulls us in the other direction. And it's kind of a battle we have with the algorithms to make sure that the better impulses that humans have get preserved. But why am I mentioning that right now? I just want to leave your listeners thinking about the complexity that is built into what AI is becoming, which is, to the extent it can reflect us humans and imitate us a little bit more, it will also be important for us to judge what aspects of our own selves we actually want to instantiate and where we want to hold back. For example, we all know that we occasionally have real conflicts in terms of what we want. You want one thing at time one, you want a different thing at time two. You want to eat the chocolate, you don't want to eat the chocolate. You want to exercise, you don't want to exercise. How then a system that is designed to achieve our goals actually manages those intertemporal utility conflicts is a huge question. It's a way that like political philosophy is becoming an engineering problem. I think that's really cool. And the more people are aware of that and understand that, the more they're likely to have a positive relationship with technology.
Mm-hmm. I like that. So technology is a reflection of us, and us trying to manage our better angels through technology and trying to kind of mute those aspects of our humanity that
Bingo. It calls the question of whether, if we want it to help us be somebody, do we want it to help us be the person we are, the person we would like to become, the person others would like us to be? Like, that begins to be actually an actual choice you can make.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's new and exciting, but also strange.
I agree. And you know what's both exciting and terrifying about it is it requires us to see ourselves clearly. And I think that's maybe the first challenge.
Brian, that is very well said.
Well, thank you so much. I really had a fun time talking to you. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Me too. This was fun. Thanks for what you're doing, and let's connect again before long.
Let's do it.